Hello, yat. She'e Rachel Soyaninshia, Towanana Denea Ashkenazi Jew, Nishle, Towanana Denea Scott Bashishchin, Wallace de Shiche, Cox de Chanelli, Tohik Lini Baja'a Yaninshle. I am a lecturer here in the School of Communication and Journalism and Communication, and I'm very, very honored to introduce Marley Shebala. I'm actually getting a little choked up as our moderator. I first learned about Marley when I was a college student in Yellow Springs, Ohio in 1992, when in my environmental communication class, I read a packet about the Navajo Hopi Relocation Act. And there were articles in there that Marley had written about both Navajos and Hopis that were resisting Peabody coal. And it was through reading those articles that I became interested in coming out, and I came out here as a scholarship requirement, and I have basically been here ever since. So in many ways, thanks to Marley, my life here has happened, and I'm very honored by that. Well, yeah, I guess I am honored too. I'm getting flubbered, because I'm so happy to have her here. I'm very honored that she's here. So Marley has been a journalist and a photojournalist on the Navajo Nation for 28 years. She has won multiple awards, including having a fellowship to teach environmental journalism at the University of California, Berkeley. She was named the Arizona Community Journalist of the Year by the Arizona Press Club multiple times, and many Native American Journalist Association awards, including the Richard LaCourse Investigative Journalism Award. She is known as being an undaunted muckraker, and because of her, our Navajo Nation justice system is held accountable.
Thank you. Yeah. Marley Shebala Yinshia, Tohe Glini and Shlon, Nanest Esha, Chatanet Bashichin. And my name is Marley Shebala. That's my label. But who I am is where the waters come together. That's my mother's clan. And my father's clan is Frog. He's Zuni, and my mother is Dine. And the first question I'd like to ask the panel, but I'd also like to encourage each one of you to become involved and ask questions of these panelists, because they're here and they have a lot of knowledge, they have a lot of experience, and instead of just one side speaking, get involved, ask your questions, whatever it is that you always wanted to ask a journalist. We're usually the ones that are always out there, asking you questions. So now you have a chance to question the journalists, all right? So we're going to start over here, and each one of them will, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and also give a definition of what media justice means to you, to each one of you.
Hello, I'm Shondiin Silversmith. Honagani Lishe, Kiani Bush's team, Bilagani Dashiche, Tolichitni Dashnale. I am a Dine journalist. I've been a journalist for about 10 years now, and I've worked at small newspapers, and now I'm working for the Arizona Republic. So what media justice means to me, it's kind of interesting, because when I first got into journalism, I didn't realize how important Indigenous voices are for journalism, because you don't see them very often, especially in mainstream journalism, in mainstream media, anywhere. So when I first became a journalist, it was really daunting to me not to be able to find stories about my own people in mainstream media, or not be able to quickly browse through a newspaper or a website and find stories about Indigenous communities. So in terms of media justice, I feel that it's important for Indigenous journalists and non-Native journalists to give these stories a chance, and to make sure that these stories get told, especially letting Indigenous people tell their own stories, letting the community tell their own stories. And that's kind of what media justice means to me, is giving a voice to Indigenous communities.
Oshio Oshigotsu and Sta. I'm Daisy Purdy. I'm Eastern Band Salaki from the Snowbird Mountains. I feel like I'm running for office right now. This is kind of intense or under investigation, but I guess these days it's kind of the same thing now, right? So in terms of what media justice means to me, sort of in a nutshell, I think that inherently media justice goes hand in hand with recognizing that certain voices are overprivileged and overheard while other voices are suppressed and those stories aren't told, or when they are told, it's somebody from the outside coming in and telling their story for them through their cultural lens versus creating opportunity and space for underrepresented communities to tell their own stories to the benefit of their own communities. And along those lines, I think that when we talk about media justice, we can talk about it in a passive sense as something that just happens, or we can recognize the privilege that we have to be here today and see it as our responsibility to support that happening. And along those lines, I'm asked to speak here. I teach for ethnic studies and applied Indigenous studies. I'm not a journalist. But I also think it's our responsibility to support people who are doing that good work in our community. And with that said, I'm going to ask Deidre Peaches over there to stand up and introduce herself and tell y'all what she does. Because if you have a checkbook in your pocket, you should write Paper Rocket Productions a check to do the amazing work that they're doing.
If you have any questions or you want to address the panel, please come to the microphone.
Torchini Nishlin Logatine Abashashin. Ashihan Dashache, Kiani Dashanelle. It's good to see you guys here. Journalism is really important. Being a Native American filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, it's sometimes when you're there on the front lines, it's like you're the only one. Your camera is protecting you and everyone that you're filming and who you're talking to. So it can be used as a way as like a protection in a sense. I co-own a company called Paper Rocket Productions. We're a local Flagstaff production company that's been running since 2011. I and Jay Koingwa run Paper Rocket. And so we do a lot of social justice media content for Native and other audience members. And so I'm just pleased to be here. Thank you.
Why don't you mention the award you received also from the International Uranium Film Festival?
Yeah. So a couple days ago on Saturday, I attended a Uranium International Film Festival in Window Rock, and I won the Best Native Filmmaker Award there. So very good, pleased to be here. Thank you.
This wasn't staged. I didn't even know Deidre was going to be here. But as long as we're tooting the horn of the work that her and Jake are doing, I think it's also important to recognize that they were the youngest Native Americans to ever have a film in Sundance Film Festival. So supporting their work is key because it truly makes a difference and gives back to their respective communities.
Absolutely.
So before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional landowners and land users of this area. There are at least 13 different tribal nations that consider this area a sacred place. And in honoring those ancestors, I just wanted to acknowledge and recognize them here today. So yeah, Dr. Ora Marek-Martinez inshe, Zetlani nishle, do nimi pui patese bashishchin, ado kisani e dashiche do belagane edishnale. My mom is Navajo, Mountain Cove clan. My father is Nez Perce from Idaho, and he is from the Eagle Feather Band. My maternal grandfather is Hopi Sun Clan from Oraibi, and my paternal grandfather is actually Bohemian and Italian. I'm a Haskell Rascal. My parents met at an intertribal university in the 70s, and so here I am. As far as what social and media justice means to me, I'm actually an archaeologist. I worked for the nation for about 16 years before I came here. And so for me, social justice has really become an act of reclaiming our histories and reclaiming our narratives from this dominant perspective, a Western-based perspective of who we are and where we come from. And so a lot of the work that I do is really recognizing that Indigenous lifeways and philosophies deserve a place in the same sort of arena as Western education and Western research models. And so, like I said, a lot of my work comes from that area, but it's always within the arena of reclaiming and reviving those ways of life for people. And so that's what it means to me.
Good evening. I'm Loris Taylor. I am the president and CEO of Native Public Media. We currently have approximately 60 radio stations and 4 television stations serving Indian country across 15 states. And it took a lot of hard work to get us there. I'm Hopi and Acoma, so welcome to Flagstaff. Media justice, I think, really is about owning our power to speak and to be heard. It's also about media access, control, and ownership. Media access not just to media talent, but to infrastructure and funding and capital, and media ownership, about owning our agency to tell our own story. It's about owning our right to tell stories from our lens, from our experiences, because if you don't tell your own story, somebody else will tell it for you, and that's the bottom line. I think ownership is also about facilities. If you own your own broadcast facilities, it's about telling stories that are related to everything that your community is about. It's about localism. Finally, I think it's about control. Control over the images that are depicted about who you are. I think we're very familiar about the myths, the untruths that are out there about Native Americans. You can look at old Western movies just to get a hint of what's out there. So I think control has to be a part of that larger picture. And then finally, I think it's about a very strong, healthy, and robust ecosystem. Media doesn't function by itself. It's not just journalists. If you can visualize a wheel, there are several spokes that make up the media landscape. So we need academia. We need pipelines for young people into media, like the Andy Harvey program. We need journalists. We need people that are production and content developers. We need people behind the mic, in front of the mic, before the camera, behind the camera. We need engineers. And so I think it's a larger ecosystem, and I think if any one of those spokes is fragile or vulnerable, then it affects all the other parts of the ecosystem.
Dos. My name is Leila Monaghan. I'm a linguistic anthropologist and historian here at Northern Arizona University. My mother's people are English and my father's people are Irish. I became connected to Native American communities when I moved to Laramie, Wyoming, which I consider my other home to Flagstaff. And as an anthropologist, the only thing I have to add to the eloquence of my fellow panelists is that I think recognizing indigenous ceremonies and indigenous traditions as indigenous media, as ways to get messages out, as ways to connect people together, is a really important part of sort of recognizing indigenous voices.
And we have one more panelist.
Hi, Gonzales with the National Native News. Hi, Marley, Loris, and all new friends here tonight. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. As a fellow Arizonan, moved to New Mexico, shout out to all the Arizona tribes and recognize the indigenous lands. I am a Navajo from Arizona and grew up also in Arizona and New Mexico, and I'm here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, so acknowledge the tribes here in New Mexico as well. I've been involved in Native radio for more than 14 years with Kiwanis Broadcast Corporation, and our mission at National Native News is not only to bring Indigenous voices of people here in the United States, but also the world. And also, I think it's really important that we recognize the Native journalists and the Native American Journalists Association. And also, I wouldn't be here today if my parents didn't both go to NAU and meet at the Denny's there in Flagstaff. I'm here today, so thank you, Mom and Dad, for meeting me. Shout out to you, and just very gracious to be here and happy to share my perspective on Native media and also collaboration, because I've also been involved in public television. I started out in mainstream television, but also been involved in public television the last few years, and Solutions Journalism Network. And a huge part, I think, of sharing Indigenous stories is collaborating with mainstream media so that we have Native producers, Native writers, Native reporters, telling and sharing our stories. And also what Loris was saying is bringing up the next generation to also be storytellers, where it's already in our blood. And I'm very honored to be here tonight. Thank you.
And do we have any questions from the audience to any of the panelists here? When we were, before we came over here, we had a dinner and we were all talking, and one of the young men who is sitting here, I asked him, how do we reach out to the young people? I don't know how many of you get your, I don't know where you get your news at, if it's from print or mostly from social media or radio. And so how do we reach our young people, panelists? How have you thought about that? Because, you know, if we're going to be cultivating our young professionals, how do we reach out to them?
So I consume media just as much as I write it and produce it and stuff like that. And a lot of the way that I consume media is online. I feel that there has been a massive shift in the media industry to where digital first has become a very important step that a lot of media organizations have taken. But it's also a very challenging one because you're also competing against all of the other organizations that are trying to reach the same audience that you are. I think one of the ways that people reach to younger people is through social media and through online stories, and making sure that you push those stories either through Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, because there is this consistent mobile device in a lot of people's hand that they scroll through timelines, they scroll through news feeds, they search online, and that's how I get my news. I think the only time that I sit down and read a paper is when I don't have access to it online. Like the Navajo Times, I read the print paper when I get the chance, or if I feel like reading mainstream media, I read the Sunday New York Times. But most of the time I read my news online. I go to the different Facebook pages, or I go to the different websites of the media networks that I follow. And I feel that when news organizations want to make a push, they always have the tendency to make it digital first. And a lot of news organizations are doing that, especially Native news organizations now. Like Indian Country Today is really moving towards that digital push. They're making sure that they're getting their content out online and getting it out quickly and making it accessible to people. So I think when you want to reach that type of audience, a lot of young people are online doing it, and that's one way to do it.
I was conflicted when you asked this question, because initially I was like, ooh, I'm a young person, and then I realized, wait, I mentioned checkbooks earlier, and everybody Venmos now, so it's kind of I'm not so much a young person anymore, but I think in response to that inquiry, I teach race identity and film here on campus, and I think multimedia is a huge way to approach media where there isn't sort of a one-size-fits-all approach where folks are just reading print media, or they're just listening to radio, or they're just watching news. And social platforms, I'm learning, are huge avenues to do that sort of thing. I'll give you an example. I do a lot of community work, and one of the community organizers that I work with was saying, "I want to promote you online." And I said, "Well, what does that even mean? Like, what is promotion online?" She's like, "Oh, Instagram, we'll get you on Indigenous Goddess Gang." And I'm all, hey. But, speaking the language of youth and understanding where they're accessing things, and also not discrediting. I think we have a tendency to think that youth are one sort of uniform front, that all consume things in the same way, and we don't give enough credit where credit is due. And we think about, at least traditional teachings in my community, youth and elders are our knowledge holders, and it's those of us in between that get lost in all the mix and all the chaos and all the noise and commotion. So really recognizing that there's agency that exists with young people, and creating avenues by which they can tell their own stories, and we're promoting them rather than expecting them to come to us for those sources.
So I forgot to mention that part of my job here at NAU is I'm the executive director here at the Cultural Center. And so part of my job is programming and reaching out to our students. And so when I came in, I had this really sort of, very closed off picture of what it meant to do public outreach. And so for me, just taking that sort of one size fits all model, I felt that the best way to reach all of our students was social media. And so, we tried that, we tried to reach out, and what we found is that it did reach about half of the students that we were outreaching to, but the other half actually preferred face-to-face communication. And so, what I've learned is we can't always make assumptions about what our youth need and what they want. It's best to ask them and let them tell us what they want. And I can't speak for any other students, and so that's something just personally for myself. And one of the traditional teachings that I was taught was you can't speak for everybody. So why would I assume that I know what all of the diversity amongst our students, what do they actually want? And so I found, like I said, that it's better to communicate with our students face to face and not just treat them like these faceless kind of automatons behind this little thing here, right? I know we all get caught up in it, but what better way to connect to one another and to mentor students than to connect face to face? And so I think that still has a lot of value. And in my other job as an archaeologist, one of the most difficult aspects of my job was reaching out to youth and trying to talk to them about becoming future archaeologists and anthropologists. And on the Navajo Nation, archaeology itself is a very taboo word. And so I had to find other ways to reach out to students, and I had to adjust my own lens and adjust the assumptions that I held about our youth. And when I sort of readjusted that lens and started talking about what we were actually doing, protecting the landscape and trying to revitalize our traditions and our culture, I had a lot more students who were more interested in that piece. And it wasn't until I actually went out there and started talking to our youth and our communities that I realized that. And so I think that's probably, one of the best ways is as a combination of those methods. So, yeah.
I think this is a really excellent question. And I think it speaks to something larger because it's not just about the consumption of media, but it's really about developing capacity and really working towards having media makers that are part of a larger informed society. I don't think you can have a robust and healthy democratic system unless you have young people that participate in this larger ecosystem. And I think one way to do that is to really show how youth, if given the opportunity, can perform. So I'll give you a few examples. KUYI Hopi Radio, which serves the Hopi Nation, connected the local Hopi Junior Senior High School directly to the radio station when I was GM there. And what we did was we connected a classroom to the station, from 3 locations from the high school: the classroom, the gymnasium, and the football field. And it's not just about making a roadway for these young people to join the radio station, but it's really bringing broadcasts to them, which is a different model. The second thing we did was we encouraged the Hopi Junior Senior High School to adopt a class in radio and journalism as part of the curriculum, not a radio club that's temporary, not a situation where it could be vulnerable to the annual appropriations process or budgeting process, but to be a part of the menu of subjects that can be offered at the high school. Why? Because media is one area that is, it's about critical thinking. It's about writing. It's about all those things that academia can offer rolled into these classes. I think the other way that we've attempted to include youth was the Andy Harvey program. Paul Helford, I don't remember, 8 or 9 years ago, we were talking about this boot camp where we thought, let's target high school students, not when they're entering college, but when they're still in high school, where they're in their formative years, and introduce them to a field that's not readily available to them. So I think in terms of vulnerable communities, those communities that are unserved and underserved by media, you have to reach out and build these pipelines. And it's a lot of work. It's expensive. And thank you, Northern Arizona University, for being a partner in that pipeline. Finally, I think the First Amendment is not something that's taught around the kitchen table, right? So maybe in your homes, but certainly wasn't in mine. One of the things that Native Public Media is doing is we went out and developed our own First Amendment protectors curriculum. Why? Because of Standing Rock. Now, if Standing Rock was a microcosm of all the assaults that you can imagine happen around the First Amendment, right? I mean, there were free press zones that were developed that geographically distanced reporters from where the action was taking place. There were long-range acoustic devices used to disperse crowds. There was the militarization of law enforcement that came out to control crowds. There were all kinds of things happening, data sweeps, facial recognition. This was where tensions were built around technology and people and the lack of it and its exposure of what can happen when media is absent. Because in the first months of Standing Rock, there literally was no news per se coming out through mainstream media. The way I got my news was from KLND, the Lakota station. I got it from the drone operators and citizen reporters that were on the ground, from journalists that were Native, like Jenny Monet and Antonia Gonzales, and people that were there who knew that this story was important to Native Americans across the country. And when media is absent, a lot of things can happen when nobody's watching. You can get people doused with freezing cold water on a very cold, frigid night. You can have people that can be put in harm's way. My son was there. I was constantly on the phone. This is when you learn about tribal jurisdictions as well. I think one of the advice I gave my son was, when you go to bed tonight, make sure that you're on Lakota lands, because when the military of law enforcement comes in, it's going to be a jurisdictional battle as well. So I think the point is this. One of the lessons that we learned out of Standing Rock was that When we send our children out there to speak on behalf of issues that are important to them, like climate crises or like water is life, we never imagine that we're putting our children in harm's way. We never imagined that our journalists would be arrested and put in dog cages. We never imagined that the incarceration of people because they were there to exercise their First Amendment right, which is also the right to assemble, would be under assault. And so one of the lessons that I know that we learned at the Standing Rock in terms of our work from Native Public Media was to develop a curriculum that would reach out to young people and adults and to say, do you know what your First Amendment rights are? And do you know what boundaries exist around the First Amendment? And I think it's important. I think it's important for academia to start teaching what our First Amendment rights are. I don't think we know enough about it. I don't think we understand that standing on the street could be harmful to our future. And so youth are at the core. It was the youth that started Standing Rock. They were the movement until us adults decided to get smart and join that movement as well. But thank you for the Andy Harvey program, certainly here at Northern Arizona University. I think it's a stellar program. I think it does exactly what it needs to do, and I hope that it proliferates across the country.
Thank you for sharing that. One of my other hats is as a very small publisher. And when I got involved in publishing, one of the things that I was confronted by was that 90% of children's books do not feature heroes or heroines of color. So it's interesting to hear people talking about youth and then thinking about how do we define youth. And I think that we have to define youth back to very small children. And that one of the aims of any media outreach should not only to be, I remember starting kind of engaging with the news when I was 10, 11, 12 years old. But in some ways, my preparation to engage with the media at the age of 12 was because I was reading from a very young age. And how can we develop communities, materials that reflect Indigenous voices for children from a very young age? I was having a conversation with Aura earlier today about how the expectations for Indigenous children are incredibly low. In the state of Wyoming, which is the one I'm most familiar with, they expect 62% of white children to be proficient in reading. And their goal, their 15-year goal, is to have 37% of Native American children to be proficient in reading. And that statistic itself, that they just hope to get to 37%, just shows that the education system is failing these children, and that the sort of the materials that they are being offered are pushing them out of the way. So when we think about youth, I think we should think about, all the way back to picture books, all the way up to, sort of college level and beyond. And that one of the programs that we should think about is how can we connect fiction and nonfiction, connect the skills that children need with the activism that we hope that youth will have when they get to an age of agency.
Okay, Antonia.
I'm a huge advocate for young Native people getting into journalism as a mentor with the Native American Journalists Association and also students in Albuquerque who are both in high school and college. Who better to tell our stories than our young people who are already storytellers? Our young people are already using their smart devices, sharing their perspectives. but also having that backing of a college education. I think that's very important to go to school and learn. I came from old school journalism. And so learning that and having that backing, I have to give a shout out to Haskell Indian Nations University, where Rhonda Labaldo is an instructor in one of the only tribal colleges in the United States, teaching media and communications to our tribal students, because like Loris was saying, our tribal media are often the first people on the scene when stories are happening. Who better to tell our stories, but also having that journalism backing and being having that objectivity and what we learned in school, but also knowing the sensitivity of our communities, because that's a huge part of reporting on Indigenous communities. That when the Dakota Access Pipeline was happening, the tribal radio stations were first on the scene and were there when it started, with the Native youth running from Standing Rock to Washington, D.C., who started this whole movement. It was our tribal media who was there at the forefront covering all of these issues. And also just our Native students having a voice today, starting, looking back at my career, giving credit to Naja for helping boost and get me into mainstream television, because that was not easy. Today we're seeing more of our Native people in television, not enough, but also we need people in management roles. But looking back today, as our students today need to have not just whatever medium they're focusing on, but everything. Our students need to know print, our students need to know broadcasting, our students need to know both broadcast and radio and television, and also social media. I mean, our students today really need to know every single medium that's out there, and they're already doing it on their smartphone, so why not encourage them and help them and give that backing? And right now in Albuquerque, we're having a huge story where our young people are already at the forefront covering this huge story in New Mexico that's happening, where an former Albuquerque teacher now was accused of cutting a Native student's braid, and also calling a student a bloody Indian. It was our Native young people who were bringing that to the scene. So I think it's very important that the Indigenous young people are bringing their stories and their voices to the forefront, but also encouraging them and having them get that backing of the education as well. So I think we're already storytellers by nature. Our young people already have even more experience with social media than I can. They're already sharing their voices and their stories, but also giving them encouragement and resources through Native Public Media and NAJA and anywhere else where they can get an education and pursue journalism as a career, because I know how tough it is, but also that we need to be the people also sharing our stories and telling it.
Okay. So our discussion was regarding how do we reach out to the young people. So there's a lot of young people here, and I see you nodding your heads. You're reacting. You hear what's being said. So let's hear from you. Do you want to come up here and let us know, give a grade to some of the panelists here, and let them say, oh, yeah, you were right. No, you were wrong. Do we have any takers here? Come on, young people.
Hi guys, so thank you for sharing all of your insight. It's inspiring me quite a bit right now. But I had a question regarding, like, for Native students who go to school and, they're bound to meet a type of professor in their lifetime that knows nothing about them. There was a time in high school where a teacher asked someone to give an example of genocide. And I was the only student who brought up the Trail of Tears. And this teacher laughed at me, and she said, that's not genocide. So it gave me a couple days to stand up to her, but it's important to kind of understand how damaging that is for the students. So I don't know what families could do to prepare their young students for the real world and how they're able to defend themselves. My parents did a pretty good job at preparing me for the world. My dad is a Native historian, so I'm already aware of that. But if I was a student who knew nothing about my history or my culture, then that really would have hurt. So I guess my question would be how how would you guys imagine is the best way to prepare like other students? Like I'm a mentor for the Andy Harvey workshop and I'm going to continue doing so, but I just want to know like things we could do to kind of get them to understand that they're going to come across these encounters with other people.
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, my name is Ashley Craig. I am Navajo and White Mountain Apache.
Thank you.
So, I think a lot of Indigenous students have that type of experience especially when they leave the reservation or they leave the comfort of Native communities always surrounding them. I was one of them. I got my master's degree in Boston, and going to the East Coast, it was a really jarring experience because I've been surrounded by Native people my entire life. I grew up on the res. I started my journalism career on the res. So going off the reservation and not being able to see my own people or being able to see media represent my people or anything like that, it's really hard to deal with. And it's hard for anybody. It's hard for young people. It's hard for somebody my age, and it's really jarring. But I think one of the things that is so great about Indigenous communities is that once you find it, they're so welcoming. Because when you find people who are interested in the same things you are, or you find somebody that you can connect with when you talk to them about these type of issues that only Indigenous people understand, they talk it through with you. Because being in Boston and when I was experiencing Halloween for the first time, it was the first time I ever saw a non-Native person in a headdress, and it's so jarring. It's such a, because you hear about it on media, you see it on social media, but when you see it in person, it's something that is just a different experience. And I remember I'm like, what? and it's true, like you don't really know what to do in that situation, so you kind of just have to ask yourself, like, okay, well, that happened, and you have to start thinking about, I guess it's hard because when you're the only Indigenous person in the room, you all of a sudden become the spokesperson for all the other Indigenous communities, because no one learns about their own history. And it's crazy that it's such a heavy responsibility for Indigenous people when they go out into non-Native communities, because you have to constantly explain that there are over 560 Indigenous tribes in the United States, and I'm only part of one of them, so I can tell you my experience, but you asking me to kind of give this blanket of what Indigenous rights are or what Indigenous history is, it kind of doesn't give justice to all of these different nations. So I think when young people go off to college and they're going off into a community they're not familiar with and they're going into an environment they're not familiar with, it's always good to remember to reach out to different Native resources within those communities. Try to do a little bit of research about the campus you're going on, see if there is a Native American club, if there is a Native American center in that city, if there is some type of little olive branch for you to connect back to your community. It does wonders. It keeps you centered, and it helps. So that's all I can offer on this.
Yeah, I had quite the opposite experience. I actually grew up in an Irish Catholic neighborhood in Boston and was the only Native person other than my mom in the neighborhood. And, personally I remember feeling like it was dirty and trying to clean my skin so I could be whiter, like this pristine image of idealized, by the media of what beauty is, that Western beauty aesthetic. And I think something that we need to be mindful of when we think about consuming media and what we're taking in is oftentimes Indigenous people are either invisibilized in media, or they're exploited for their quote-unquote plight, which seems to be this disease that's just associated with Native people for some reason. And so I think in response to what you were asking, it's really important for us to celebrate the accomplishments that exist out there, and beyond that, to be building each other up instead of breaking each other down, because there are tensions that exist within and between our communities as a result of colonization that we really need to challenge when we re-indigenize these messages that we're taking. And I really appreciate the word choice that Ora used earlier when she talked about reclaiming, because so often our stories are told to us in a way that our language was lost, and we need to shift that message and recognize language was taken. It wasn't lost. Lands weren't lost. Lands were stolen. And it's really important to be true and to be honest about those things, and not to internalize that colonization and that message in a way that we're victimizing ourselves and not recognizing the strength and resilience that exists within our communities, because we are still here, because genocide is real, and we're survivors because of our ancestors and because of their strength. And there's a really important term that's resonated with me for quite some time. I think it was coined by Gerald Visner. And it's this term called survivance, and it's a combination of resistance and survival. And it speaks specifically to humor, and humor being at the foundation of who we are as Indigenous people, of our communities, and how we can communicate even outgroup beyond that, because it's a common language. And it's a way to address some of these issues that are so real and so exhausting and are there every day, but in a manner that is sustainable, because we can laugh and we can joke without making light of them. They're real, but it enables us to continue on and to survive and to address these really difficult issues in a way that we're also healing from humor.
So, in terms of preparing, right, I think that was your question, right, of how to prepare. So, I'm a mother. I have 3 children, 8-year-old twins and an 11-year-old. And, they're born here in the city, and so they have a very different upbringing than I had. I was born in Idaho on a Nez Perce reservation, grew up there, and my experience up there was really sort of shaped by the Aryan nation that was probably 30 minutes north of where we were. And so where I grew up was very anti-Native American. There was very much a white supremacist kind of feeling there. And so, my mom, being Navajo, she was very much about peace and very much about keeping my own composure and my own integrity. Whereas my Nez Perce side, my aunts and my father were very much about being warriors. And so I grew up with that sort of messaging and that ethic about remembering that the fight that I'm fighting will be the same one that those coming up behind me will fight. And so I always had that ethic of creating a path, creating ways for the youth to come up behind us. And, I suffered a lot from taking that approach, because it wasn't just sort of this mental sort of shift, but there was a physical aspect as well. And so for me, it was a battle growing up and being Native, and being told that I was just a squaw, I was just a woman, and that my place was not within this sort of public sphere. It wasn't in leadership, it wasn't in academia. And I was given that message all the way up until I was a senior in high school. And I graduated from Coconino High School. And so, I had that experience of growing up in that sort of very communal, very much supportive environment, but we had to fight the outside. And so, I came to Flagstaff and everything had to shift. All of that sort of messaging, my philosophies, my strategies had to shift because I couldn't survive. And I remember my first sort of week in school at Coconino High School, I was almost suspended because I would not stand up to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And I didn't understand what was going on. And so, it took my mom coming in and sort of riling everybody up and letting them know that that was my right. And so, she took me home, and after that, it was like a lecture, right? You need to be mindful of what you say. You have to be careful here because it's very different than where you were. And so, fast forward 20 years, and I'm raising my own children in this environment. And how do you explain to a 5-year-old what genocide is, who Christopher Columbus is, who he represents, what he represents? How do I explain to a 5-year-old what happened to their people? Why we have to go to a reservation in order to go home, right? And so I took the option, the strategy of telling the truth and seeing and trying to break that down so that my young children would understand. And it was, at first I felt guilty about sort of breaking it down in that way, but then for me it was survivance. It turned to survivance, and that was the one way, the strategy that I was able to sort of hang on to in order to remember who I am and remember that there's always a fight, right? That we always have to stand up for something. And being that, we fight for our communities, we fight for our people, we fight for that blood, you have to be truthful. And the more that you lie, the more that you try to cover things up, the worse it's going to be. And, I've had plenty of calls from my children's teachers about why would you tell a, 5-year-old, 8-year-old, 11-year-old those things? And I tell them because it's history. It's truth. It's our truth. It's my truth. And so, I back up a little bit on that warrior stuff, but only for a little while because that's what made me who I am. And I'm proud of who I am. I'm proud of my people. I'm proud of my community. And that's why I'm here, is to make sure that the youth that I work with, the students that I work with, still maintain that resiliency and that pride in themselves. That's important to me. So long-winded, but survivance and honesty, really.
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you for your courage to speak up. But I think you speak to a much larger issue. Unfortunately, media is also a commodity, or thought to be a commodity instead of a service by many. And when it becomes a commodity, it's really about power and control. Power and control is about having the dynamics where whose story gets told. And we see this everywhere. We see this in the textbooks of our high school where perhaps we're invisible. There was a study, I believe it was in 2010 that came out, that was called Walk a Mile. And the study was basically a survey of Americans, and the questions were simply asking Americans what they knew about Native Americans. And so what came out of that study was that a lot of Americans felt that Native Americans were extinct, and if they were alive, they were either living in teepees, the usual stuff, right? Things we already know about. Well, Reclaim Native Truth is another series of more recent research that was done by the First Nations Development Institute out of Colorado. Those same stereotypical ideas about Native Americans exist today. And still, there's this tension between power and control. Years ago, I did work with the Center for the Center for the Prevention of Violence, which was centered out of Tucson. And our work was there to help rehabilitate survivors of torture. And some of our clients were individuals that were local community people from Ecuador, Chile, from Bosnia, that wanted to start radio stations. And it was my first really introduction to the power of media and learning that, for example, if we attack another country, right? It's the media network that's one of the top targets. I think they said it's like one of the top 10. And so when you're in power and when you have control over your stories, it's your history that gets to be told. And there are all kinds of mechanisms to suppress for those that are in power and control, for those who aren't in power and control. We see this in book banning of books, right? We see this in the Arizona State legislative move. I think it was House Bill 1871, was it? Was it 22? Okay. That made ethnic studies prohibitive in the state of Arizona for those schools that were funded by the state. And so it also comes through English-only movements, right? Whose language then becomes the predominant voice of the state. So there's all different kinds of ways, but there are also other ways where our power can be exerted, and we certainly saw that in the renaming of Squaw Peak, right, where it became Piestewa Peak, right, which is much more, I think, what Arizona should be about. It's about the people down, I believe, in Prescott, who spoke out against the state legislator, right, for saying that African Americans just don't blend in, right? So I think there are ways, and I think the power that you had was to be able to speak from your agency as a young person to say, my history counts, and from my point of view, from my lens, the Trail of Tears was akin to genocide. And it's the first, sometimes it's those baby steps, right? But if you're willing to hear the history of others, we hope that they're willing to hear your history as well.
It's in some ways the project that's going on in this room is about that preparation, right? To be a media, to be somebody who can do media is somebody who can observe, who can tell the truth, who can recontextualize things in a way that's appropriate for this community. So you are doing this preparation for yourself right now, and I just hope all of you share that with your younger brothers and sisters and cousins.
I think a big part of it is finding a mentor. I had great mentors. Conrad Chino is one of my mentors, who was one of the first Native Americans in television here in New Mexico in mainstream. He was a longtime reporter in the investigative unit at one of the television stations in Albuquerque. And I worked with him for a long time going through college. Also joining Native organizations to have that backing, because you miss that community, that connection to your family when you're at college. And then just the young people today having the power to speak out. It reminds me of covering the story that's continuing here in Albuquerque with this former teacher who's accused of calling a student a bloody Indian and also cutting a Native student's braid. Where the Native community in Albuquerque really was the young people, the students coming up and putting pressure on the district, and also an advocacy group called the Red Nation, which is a grassroots group in New Mexico that is not only backing the Indigenous students at this high school, but also backing the Entrada, which was a former pageant here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which was honoring conquistadors. It was the Red Nation, it was the young people speaking out and telling the history of the pueblos here. They're also now fighting development near Chaco Canyon, which is a sacred site for tribes not only in New Mexico, but in the Southwest. And so it really is about featuring these young voices and having that backing of knowing your history and your culture, and going back to having young people being the ones who are sharing their stories, because it really is these young people who are also getting these issues in the media, not only just tribal media, but mainstream media as well. And also just having those mentors and joining those Native groups. And like the student there was saying is, sometimes it even is educating your own teachers at your college, at your high school, wherever you are, which is what's occurring here in New Mexico as well. So it's kind of universal that we're seeing across the United States.
I would like to ask the panelists, since we've been talking about community and informing the community at all levels, children, all ages, from all backgrounds. So how much energy do you think we should put any energy into trying to get our stories into mainstream? Or is it more important to educate our own community? Does that help empower them?
So I've written for tribal media, and I've written for mainstream media, and I think that you should always pitch stories about Indigenous communities, especially if you have the power to do it, if you have the opportunity to do it. I know that I have been on the end of editors telling me that this is an important story, and why is this important? Why do people care about it? And this is just a small portion of this community. And one of the examples that I like to use is when I was getting my graduate degree, as part of one of my theses, I was writing about the Wampanoag tribe and how they are revitalizing their language and reclaiming it and getting their youth really involved in it. And I thought it was a great story. They had a branch in Quincy. They are very close to Boston. So I was like, I'm going to pitch this story and I'm going to use it as my graduation thesis, and it's going to be amazing. I'll write a story about it. I'll do video. I'll do all the bells. And I was like, cool, this works. No, my teacher didn't want it. So, and it was kind of baffling to me when he told me, he was like, this is too small. This doesn't relate to Boston. How does this relate to Boston? And I just remember telling him, there is literally a branch in Quincy where they are teaching their Indigenous communities about their language. I was like, how is this not related to Boston? How is this not related to any of these audiences? And I kind of refused to let it go. And I was like, if you don't want this story, then I'll find somebody who wants it. So I think when you are in the position to be able to pitch your stories and able to collaborate, like what Antonia was talking about, collaborate with other media outlets, collaborate with Indigenous media outlets to tell this story, then you should be able to do it, because Indigenous storytelling is important, especially when it's told by Indigenous journalists. You having the power to tell your own story gives you the opportunity to share it with the world, because it's not every day that you get to do that. And I know for a fact, especially now that I'm currently in mainstream media, and I miss writing about my community so much all the time. Like, I was a tribal reporter, and I was out in the community every single day. I was around my people every single day, and I was writing about them every single day. And when that's taken away from you and you can only do it every once in a while, it sucks. So I think when you are in a position, or you have the opportunity to pitch stories about your own Indigenous community, you should do it, even if they say no, because you are that voice at the table. You are that person that is bringing that spotlight to this community. And it sucks when people tell you no, but if you get that little peak of interest of somebody in the room that's like, I'll help you do this, latch onto it, because they will.
I think I see the biggest difference is this sort of dichotomy of justifying versus sharing. And I think that when we're in our own communities, it's a matter of sharing. And when you're, speaking to a more mainstream audience, it's justifying, which can be exhausting because it's constantly saying, what I have to say to you has value and this is why. And then having to validate that it has value, and then having to justify and having to provide so much background to create any level of understanding, because our educational institutions have done such a disservice to educating people within those institutions about all of the people within those institutions, right? They weren't created by us or for us. And so I think that the question that I oftentimes ask myself, and I challenge my students to ask themselves, is for whose benefit and at whose expense? And ultimately, is this going to be beneficial to your community and further whatever initiative it is that you'd like to see? Is this message going to be received in a capacity that's beneficial? Or is it going to be at the expense of your community, of yourself, and the role that you serve in? And really asking those difficult questions. And I also think that there's a responsibility of having access. If I'm invited to the table, I generally accept that invitation, even with a mainstream audience, because it's an opportunity for me to recognize that I got where I was because of all these doors that were opened to me, not of my own merit, but of other people that stood up for me and created those avenues. So in that regard, I feel like it's my responsibility to share when I have that opportunity, and then replenish and revitalize within my own community, and always try to bring a message that has that truth that Aura spoke of, and to really just speak that truth to power, and take that critical lens that says, who's actually benefiting from this message. So that doesn't really answer your question in any way other than, acknowledging that justification element is going to be there, being prepared for it. Having taught at a predominantly white institution for the last 10 years, ethnic studies classes that are banned in K through 12 education, to a classroom where most of the people in the class just don't understand why we're talking about narratives of people of color, why we're sharing histories and literature of underrepresented populations, and why those things matter, and why there has to be a class to do those sorts of things. And so I think strategy is involved there too. With one of the strategies that I've developed is the only materials that I assign are on the Arizona banned book list. And so, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, I'm going to stand back up again, and you might knock me back down again, but I'm not going to stay down. I'm going to stand back up again. But also that replenishing, that revitalizing, and that finding strength in community, I think is hugely important. Otherwise, you're going to get burnt out, and you're not good to anyone if you're not able to continue. So,
really great responses, I think. And so I think for me, I see the value in both. I think both are critical and necessary, not only on the mainstream sort of level, because we do need to educate people, and like the studies that were referenced, people have misinformation about Native people, Indigenous people, and it's a constant stream of misinformation, whether it's about land, whether it's about rights, whether it's our histories. There's always misinformation about who we are, where we come from, and what's important to us. And for, numerous reasons, that voice is often co-opted from us, and there are people who are deemed experts that sort of have those rights to make those statements about who we are and where we came from. But looking at the community side, I see that as being critical as well. In my community in Idaho, very small, 800 people. We had no stoplights. There's still no internet there. When I go there, I'm completely cut off to the rest of the world. But my aunt, she started the tribal newspaper there, the Tots Tutok, and it's the Good People. And she started it to not only provide media information to the residents there in Lapwai, but as a way to sort of highlight the accomplishments that our people were making. And we always sort of have this deficit narrative and sort of this victimization of Native people that's perpetuated through media. And her idea behind starting this paper, and it's an actual paper, was to revitalize the community and to nourish them. and not only just, sort of avoiding those tough sorts of stories and those sort of instances, but to celebrate who we are. And it's very much like the Navajo Times, where there's a cultural section and there's stories that are told in Nez Perce language. And so it serves many different purposes for our people, but it's specifically for our people. And I think that's something that we always sort of have to keep in mind is, we're very intentional and purposeful in what we do. And, in reclaiming this source, reclaiming this media, this space, there's a lot of power in that. And it provides a sort of, maybe not provides, but it stokes that resiliency in you to see that your people are doing this, but there are, we always recognize that there's the good with the bad, or the bad with the good. And that's what our paper does. And, if we look at the mainstream on the other side, again, there's that deficit narrative and that sort of victimization of Native people. And so, I like to go read the paper at home because it talks about the same stories, but from a very different lens. And that's really important to recognize that it's critical at those different levels as well.
So I've helped to start broadcast facilities across Indian country. And in just about every single community, there's been a really high desire by community members to have their stories told, to have public affairs be about them. Why? Because they feel they matter. So all of you in here, you matter, right? And that's really the core of localism. You want news about yourself, about your community, about the people that you know, about your environment, about your landscape, your history, your culture, your songs, your lifeways, because you matter. Now, on the other side of the coin, I think it also matters that we cover stories about issues that know no borders. The climate crisis that we're in now is a really good example. Some of the first climate refugees are Native Americans, indigenous people. Look at the state of Alaska. The sea is rising. They have no place to be relocated right now. And even if they were to be relocated, it would be a very expensive endeavor. And none of us are immune to the crisis that's happening because of climate changes. If here in Flagstaff, if the temperature rises 1 degree, right, it's devastating to our pine forest because we can get an infestation of bark beetles. And then that leads, it becomes catastrophic in other ways. Immigration is another huge issue that indigenous people ought to have their lens on and a focus on. It affects right today the Tohono O'odham people that are in the southern borders, right? Those indigenous people that are in the Americas, in the United States and between Mexico, and indigenous people that are in South and Central America that are being displaced for all kinds of reasons. A lot of it partly by the doing of our own country, right? So I think these are the untold stories. We're not hearing enough. When Katrina happened, the Houma tribe in New Orleans, close to New Orleans, they were deeply affected. We rarely heard those stories, except across Indian country where we're covering these stories. And so there are some issues that just can't be ignored, where all of us in the room have a shared responsibility to be informed about these issues, because we're not going to be able to address our climate crises unless we're all together and united in what to do about it. We're all facing calamity if we don't. And so I think the power of media has to be inclusive. Everybody has a place at the media table, and that's really how it ought to be.
Cool. Can you put on I got acquainted with, I'm from Brooklyn. I did not know Native American peoples when I was growing up, but the person who made me a scholar of Native American cultures and issues was my friend Yufna Soldier Wolf. And this is Yufna here, right behind us. And Yufna is somebody who had a vision of what she wanted. And as long as I knew her, she wanted to bring her great uncle's remains home from Carlisle School. He was sent there as a young boy and died along with 2 other members known in the Northern Arapaho tribe. And I post this picture because I think it's a really successful example of how a Arapaho concern that was organized and led by Yufna became a national media story. Yufna is the Erin Brockovich of repatriation. She spent years writing to the Carlisle School saying, can we have our children back? Can we have our children back? And it's like, NAGPRA should let us have their children back. And they said no. And other regulations, and they said no. And then she finally said, okay, what do I need to do? And they said, well, we're military. We follow military rules. And she said, right. What are the military rules? They said, we need letters to say that you are family. So she went out and got 120 letters of people saying, we remember these people. These are our family, and they deserve to come home. And once she finally broke through that bureaucracy, it became an event. And what Yufna was able to do was to work with a local journalist in Philadelphia to express the position of the Arapaho tribe, right? And she was able to combine very traditional Arapaho ceremonies with this modern exercise of repatriation in a way that satisfied the tribe and also made for an important story that still has resonance. So the reporter, who's a man named Jeff Gamage, who's not Native, but was able to listen to the Native voices that were involved in this political effort to repatriate the children. He was then able to say, when the children were being separated at the border from their parents, this is not something that has not happened before. People have been separated from their children for hundreds of years, and it was wrong when Carlisle School did it, and it's wrong now when children at the border are being separated from their parents. And so Yufna insisting upon this act of repatriation and working with the media, I think both provided a story for the Arapaho community, but also a story for the nation that we all can learn from.
All right, thank you. And Antonia, we're going to start wrapping up, so you got to make it short and to the point. And plus you're in radio, so you should be able to do that.
Good time to talk about the collaboration and I'm very blessed to be able to tell Indigenous stories from an Indigenous perspective. Every single day is my job, which is very fortunate. But also that collaboration part of working together in a true collaboration with non-Native media organizations. There's a big difference because for years, and it still happens today, we get those calls, especially between Halloween through Thanksgiving, about Native Americans, Native American perspectives, what do Native people do on Thanksgiving? We still get those type of questions, but to have a true collaboration means reporting from developing story ideas, to developing sources, to coming up with the stories, interviewing, editing, through the whole process, and sharing those stories between the native and the non-native media organization, because it not only benefits us, but it benefits them as well, because we've had successful projects where we have worked with non-native media organizations, sharing our perspectives and sharing with their community as well. But again, having that true collaboration where we're working as a team and sharing knowledge with our non-native media partners, and not just, you see it a lot where there's breaking news or there's some kind of sensational thing going on where people are trying to break into the media. And not to say that Native media has any kind of special access, because we don't. We're like everybody else. Just because we're Native doesn't mean that we're going to get tribal leaders or any other Native people to speak with us, but there definitely is a sensitivity that Native journalists understand about culture, history, identity, and to have a true collaboration. And I think that that's a benefit. And we need journalists not only just in tribal media, but in all mainstream media as well, and also in management roles.
All right. Well, thank you. And I want to say thank you to each and every one of you for sharing your stories. And I'd like to thank each and every one of you for also being here. Thank you. Yeah.
About social media, we do have project-related social media account on Facebook and Instagram. So if you're on those platforms, please like us and retweet us or share our content. So you'll be part of the initiative that really support local news ecosystem to better serve Indigenous community and at the same time empower Indigenous people. So our social media handle is Media Justice NAU, both on Facebook and Instagram. So thank you for coming, and I hope this is going to be a fruitful experience for all. And if you want to have any extra questions, feel free to direct to our wonderful panelists.